Good morning and hello everyone. Welcome to the October live stream Q&A. I hope you can hear me well. Let's do a quick check in the chat room. Let me know how you can hear me, if the audio and video are okay. And thank you so much for joining me for this live stream Q&A. I'm just back from San Francisco, where I recently attended a couple of events, including some community events and a Patreon happy hour. It was really great to see you if you were there. And in just a few seconds, we're going to jump right into the questions you've submitted from the last month and voted on. So just give me a second. Let's check the chat room. Oh, good. Fantastic. We're trying out a low latency stream today. Let's see if that works well. That's part of the technical test we're doing. So let's get started with the first question of the day. Briz asks, Bitcoin network uptime is quoted as 99.984%. Please tell us about the other 0.016%. I've read about the technicals of the two downtime events in 2010 and 2013, and I'm curious what you know about the fundamental aspects of these events and how the community reacted or overreacted. Also, I've read that the alert system was removed in 2016. How would an emergency situation be handled now? That's the question from Briz. So let's talk about exactly what happened in those two events. The first downtime event was in 2010, and it was an event where there was a vulnerability discovered in Bitcoin. It's actually CV 2010-5139. As you can see, someone helpfully provided the information in the question. And basically what happened there was someone exploited vulnerability, which was a value overflow or underflow vulnerability, which allowed them to basically produce 184 billion Bitcoin as the Coinbase transaction of one of the blocks. And of course, you know, the reward was supposed to be just 50 Bitcoin at the time per block, and instead it was 184 billion. So just slightly over. And that event basically was a real classic software vulnerability within Bitcoin. In fact, that's fairly rare. We haven't really seen this kind of systemic vulnerability. So that caused an emergency response. The consensus of the network was that this was an invalid block because consensus rules that everyone thought they had agreed to did not allow for such an event to happen, even if the software implementation misapplied those rules and did allow for that to happen. And so as a result, a patch was issued, people upgraded their software. That block was reversed because the software recognized it as invalid, and a chain reorganization occurred. It took about six and a half hours for the new software release to happen, people to upgrade their nodes and mining nodes, and for that block to be reorganized and all of the transactions, except of course for the 184 billion Bitcoin transaction, to be replayed. The second incident, and I did not witness this incident because this was before I got involved in Bitcoin. I didn't know anything about this. I just read about it afterwards. The second incident, however, I did witness, and it was really quite fascinating. Second incident happened in 2013, and that was more specifically a problem in the implementation of the underlying database during a software upgrade. So what went wrong there was at the time, Bitcoin software, specifically Bitcoin Core software, was running the 0.7 version of the software, and the underlying database of blocks and transactions was stored in Berkeley DB, which is a type of database. So that was for the storage. Now, the underlying software, Berkeley DB, had an unfortunate bug in it, in that it could not open more than 1024 file descriptors. In the process of upgrading the database in version 0.8 of the Bitcoin client that was released, and I believe this happened in April of 2013 or something like that, version 0.8 changed the database, the underlying database, to level DB. Now, until that moment in time, the database infrastructure of Bitcoin Core was considered non-consensus, meaning that changes to the database shouldn't affect consensus, because the consensus code does not consider the database relevant. It's simply something that is invisible to the consensus rules, or should be invisible to the consensus rules. In this particular case, what happened effectively was an abstraction layer violation, where the abstraction of the database wasn't effective in shielding the consensus rules from an unfortunate bug in the underlying database. During the upgrade to 0.8, one of the miners that had upgraded to 0.8 created a block that had more than 1024 transactions, and that block was perfectly handled by the level DB database and the implementation of Bitcoin of 0.8 version that was running that. But unfortunately, any 0.7 client that encountered this block when it was broadcast on the network choked. And what I mean by choked is, in the process of trying to verify this block, the system attempted to open 1024 and then 1025 file descriptors and crashed Bitcoin Core. And Bitcoin Core 07 clients started crashing. Now, in this particular case, what would happen is they would crash, reboot, and upon starting up, they would contact the network and say, "You got any new blocks?" And they'd receive the same block that at this point had already become part of the blockchain, and try to verify it and crash again, and then reboot and crash again, and reboot and crash again. Every time they'd get presented with this block, they'd choke. It was decided at that point to roll back 0.8. And who makes that decision? That's a really critical question. So alerts went out in a variety of ways. Some of them used the built-in Bitcoin alert system that existed then, where people could issue a message signed by a handful of digital keys that were available to some participants in the development process to be able to notify people of some emergency situation. This was introduced by Satoshi in the original client, or in the early stages, if I remember correctly. And the purpose of this was, when there were very few communication channels for Bitcoin, to have a way to reach all node operators with an emergency alert by sending it over the very same P2P network as Bitcoin. However, there are some significant challenges and risks with such an approach, and it was deprecated in 2016 because at this point there are many communication channels by which node operators as well as miners can communicate and do communicate in emergencies. In this case, I actually did not receive the alert about this, but what I noticed was that my node was misbehaving, because I was actually doing some work at the time, and I started reading online that blocks were being delayed. So block times went up to almost 20 minutes because half the hash power of the network, which was running still 0.7, kept crashing. So effectively the hash rate dropped dramatically because only the 0.8 clients were able to continue, and as a result blocks were coming out more slowly. I immediately went onto the Bitcoin Developers IRC. I got contacted by a number of exchanges and others who were trying to figure out what was going on. I put them in touch with some of the core developers they didn't know at the time. I made some introductions. And, I wasn't in a position to help beyond that, so I just raised alarm with a few people that I knew, and then watched. And what happened next was really interesting, because very quickly consensus was arrived at. Again, about 6 hours later, a new version was released that basically rolled back the chain by reorganizing it around the 0.7 clients. No transactions were lost, no double spends occurred, but effectively what happened was everybody who was running a 0.8 client turned it off, and 0.7 clients continued the chain, and then that upgrade was postponed. It led to a 26 block divergence at the time, and a 26 block reorganization, and you can actually see that there's a few websites that have snapshots of what was happening at the time. Anyway, so those are the two events. That's the 0.016 downtime of the Bitcoin network. In both cases, no money was lost except for the $184 billion that were created in 2010, which of course were not real, because the understanding that everyone had the consensus rules was violated. It's an interesting concept of what happens when people think they know what the consensus rules are or how they will be applied, and then they're applied differently. It's not that different from what happened with the DAO hack in Ethereum much later. The big difference, of course, is that this was in the core software of Bitcoin, and in fact in one of the most critical components of the core software in 2010, which was the issuance of new currency and checking that currency is issued at the correct schedule, whereas the DAO hack was a separate smart contract that only affected a small part of the network. But very similar kind of response by the community. And then in 2013, it was the realization that unanticipated bugs, even in the database layer or other layers of the systems that are not part of the consensus critical code, can have an effect on the operation of consensus, even though the rules are followed accurately by all nodes. So a block with more than 1,024 transactions were perfectly valid by the rules of consensus, but none of the clients, none of the old clients running Berkeley DB could actually handle it because of a bug in Berkeley DB, and as a result causing this chain fork. All right, let me just quickly check into the chat room because that was a long answer and I want to see if everybody's having fun. Excellent. All right, let's move to the next question. Loic asks about Ethereum 2.0. Andreas, have you looked into Ethereum 2.0? Many people are trashing it on social media, of course, especially on the fact that there will need to be a second chain. Is that so? What do you think of it? Could you explain what the upgrade consists of? If there is going to be a need to transition to a new blockchain, what about all of the projects that were developed on the first one? This is a great question. I have been following Ethereum 2.0, of course, but not in a great degree of depth. Among other reasons, because there have been a lot of changes. The latest roadmap, which is now more or less clarified, was presented at DevCon in Osaka just recently, just a couple weeks ago. And I haven't looked into the details as such yet. However, what I can tell you from what I've read about it is that Ethereum 2.0, which is a simultaneous transition to a sharded architecture, and sharding is a process by which you have effectively multiple chains, or shards as they're called, which store different parts of the Ethereum underlying blockchain, so that not all clients have to validate all contracts. So effectively, it's a way of replicating the Ethereum blockchain in different shards, similar to database sharding. in such a way that if you need to validate a smart contract, you ask the participants of that particular shard that it's stored on, and if you're doing validation, you're validating one shard, not the entirety of the blockchain. So this is a scaling solution for Ethereum. That's how it is being proposed. Separately from that, of course, is the transition to a proof-of-stake system, and that's also part of Ethereum 2.0. The idea being here that several major changes that are needed in Ethereum, rather than doing these as a series of hard forks, they are going to be done as a completely new started chain. However, this chain starts with the entire state of Ethereum 1.0, the current Ethereum chain, encoded as its starting point. So let me explain that a bit. Essentially, one of the big differences between Ethereum and Bitcoin is the way accounts and code is stored. Whereas in Bitcoin you have UTXO, or coin output points, unspent transaction outputs, as you may have heard them called. In Ethereum you have an account-based system where you track the balance of accounts rather than specific coins moving around, or specific amounts moving around. You track balances of accounts. So it's an account-based system. Now this has certain disadvantages in terms of the auditability and the potential for problems in the soundness of money. It's one of the trade-offs that Ethereum makes. And that's my personal opinion, that it has some disadvantages vis-a-vis UTXO in terms of how easy it is to audit the balance of accounts. However, it has some advantages in other ways because it allows a degree of flexibility, including the ability to capture the current state, the balance of all of the accounts and code base of all of the contracts as a snapshot. And that means that in the transition to Ethereum 2.0, a point-in-time snapshot is made of the Ethereum 1 chain, and after that, Ethereum 2 is initialized with that snapshot, so that effectively all of the balances, contracts, and everything else that existed in Ethereum 1 now exist from the beginning in Ethereum 2, but without any of the history of how you got there. So rather than having the entire history of the chain, which among other things has a bunch of junk because of denial of service attacks and repeated hard forks that needed to clean up various problems with accounting and gas accounting and storage accounting and the denial of service attacks that occurred. All of that junk is gone because it's not relevant to the final state. Instead, what you get is just what are the balances at this moment in time, what are the contracts at this moment in time, and then move forward from there. So Ethereum 2.0 is a completely new chain. In fact, it's a set of shards that start clean with a snapshot of the state from Ethereum 1.0. So all of the existing contracts, accounts, balances, private keys that you have continue to work in Ethereum 2.0. The interesting question is what happens to Ethereum 1.0, and of course there is a possibility that that chain will continue to be mined. So there are some issues there because there is a difficulty bomb and things like that may need to be diffused, but also there's always the possibility that there will be people who object to the transition to Ethereum 2.0 and decide to fork the code and continue Ethereum 1.0 in some fashion, just like Ethereum Classic happened during the DAO. So you may have Ethereum Classic, Ethereum 1, and Ethereum 2 after this happens. I'm not sure what exactly is the plan for handling that particular occurrence, but one of the things we now know about blockchains is that you can neither prevent someone from forking into a new chain, nor can you prevent someone from continuing an old chain even if you've decided that it is obsolete. So in both of those cases, when there is any kind of disagreement in the blockchain space, it is very likely that both perspectives or points of view or implementations continue independently after a fork. And so it's never A or B. But due to forks, it's always now A and B. In the case of Ethereum, most of the hard forks have had very, very high levels of consensus, and as a result, nobody has tried to continue a legacy chain and not adopt a fork, with one glaring exception, of course, being Ethereum Classic, ETC, and the DAO fork. So, Ethereum 2.0, a series of shards coordinated among each other using a beacon chain, as I believe it's called. These shards are different chains, and they start from a new genesis effectively, and that genesis of Ethereum 2.0, however, captures the state of the existing Ethereum 1 chain as a snapshot in time to continue all of the existing state and allow people to continue running all of the contracts and accounts they have, but it is a new chain. Now, as to the fact that many people are trashing it on social media, I don't think there's any opinion, action, or piece of software that isn't being trashed simultaneously from every different perspective. And that's more a reflection of social media than it is of any specific idea. Next question comes from Nikita. 10 years in, and KYC, or Know Your Customer, is omnipresent in all on and off ramps. Will that change? Andres, a few years back I had a hope that the public crypto space would de-KYC over time, meaning that you would not be required to provide identifying information of the purpose of your transactions and trading to public exchanges and other ways of converting fiat onto and off crypto. Crypto centralized around large hubs in the forms of exchanges or payment processes, and all of these hubs run strict KYC policy, while decentralized exchanges eventually have not become a thing. Under these circumstances, even if people were to use mixers and other anonymization techniques, they would eventually run into KYC when converting into fiat or when trying to buy something via one of the payment processors. Is there any hope for open, borderless, neutral crypto, given that people seemingly choose convenience paired with KYC over superior open source solutions? Here's the thing though. Yes, the vast majority of people in Western developed countries and other developed countries that are treating Bitcoin primarily as an investment and speculation vehicle see Bitcoin and other crypto as things you invest in and therefore buy, and you buy them with what they call real money, which is fiat, and then when you get rich you sell in order to cash out into real money. And those are the kinds of expressions you hear when you're talking to newbies in the space. They come in and they think, how can I use real money to buy crypto? And then they ask you, well, how can I now cash out my crypto into real money again? That is not the experience of many people in developing countries that use Bitcoin in order to escape currency controls, massive hyperinflation, sanctions, bank runs, bank collapses, corrupt governments, dictators, and all of the other problems that exist broadly in the world. In those places, much of the crypto to fiat trading happens in person, anonymously, peer-to-peer, person-to-person, through informal channels. And these informal channels represent, in many cases, the bulk of the transactions. There may not even be exchanges in these countries. So KYC is exactly what happens in the fiat world, and if you see crypto simply as a way to invest in something outside of the fiat world, then of course you will encounter all of the limitations. So when you say, however, that it is omnipresent in all on and off ramps, that is not actually true. If you earn crypto by doing something as a professional, especially if you do it in a not developed nation, but in a developing nation, if instead of buying it, you earn it by providing your labor, by offering some kind of service, providing a product, maybe agricultural produce or crafts or even high-tech products, web design, graphic design, system administration, digital media, whatever it might be, to people who can pay you in crypto. In fact, there's very, very little KYC. Some countries require you to track who you pay even as an individual, as is the case in the US, but only to verify that they're not on a sanctions list. And beyond that, there's no real way for analytics companies to know who a Bitcoin address belongs to if you make a payment to another person through your business or as an individual once you've confirmed they're not on the naughty list. So KYC actually isn't on all on and off ramps. It's only on the investment and trading on and off ramps and some of the merchant accounts that are mostly in developing nations. And yes, that is a big problem for anonymity and neutrality, but as long as there is a way in and out, then you always have choice as an individual, and this choice is incredibly important in the developing world. Will KYC and AML go away from fiat exchanges? Probably not. It's one of those cursed policies that, regardless of its continuous failure, is promoted as a good idea. KYC and AML is a completely failed system that condemns billions of people into poverty by economically excluding them while achieving very little in terms of prosecution and law enforcement, because the truth of the matter is that most money laundering, most terrorism financing, most of the naughty things are financed either by state-level entities, are financed through banks that have banking licenses, or financed through intelligence agencies. And most money laundering, even here in the US, happens with real estate transactions of fancy condos in Miami and New York, held by real estate moguls who are effectively getting away with that. So, it's not really an effective policy, but it's a policy where all of the side effects happen to other people, mostly poor people, undocumented immigrants, and people in developing countries. And the perceived benefits are accrued to the banks, the regulators, and those in power, who both get to exert power and use these regulations to extract concessions from banks, to pressure financial institutions and control them in the case of regulators. And of course, in the case of banks, it's the devil's deal, whereby they have these massive barriers to entry that allow them to maintain the world's largest monopolistic cartels without fearing competition from either disruptive technology or new entrants, because the cost of compliance is enormous. And that's something that they can simply pass on to consumers as the cost of doing business, and it doesn't really affect their most important clients, which are other banks, other governments, and the collateralization of debt and game of musical chairs that happens in modern finance. So will KYC ever go away? No, because it's very profitable to the people who want to keep it, and all the side effects fall on other people. It is fundamentally immoral. But will crypto continue to operate with many, many on and off ramps that are not subject to this? And will it punch a giant hole into the attempts to control money and make a mockery of these ridiculous regulations that effectively cannot be enforced without totalitarian control of finance, and where the asymmetry of having even a small hole completely undermines the entire program? Yes, absolutely it will. Inheritance in the case of accidental death of owner. Maurizio asks, suppose I don't want to give my spouse the recovery phrase of my wallet, but if I die, I want my spouse to have the Bitcoin. Is it possible to configure my wallet in such a way that if I don't spend this Bitcoin within 2 years, the money is automatically transferred to my spouse's wallet? Every 2 years, I would then transfer it to another address specifying the same rule, thereby resetting the timer. But if I accidentally die after 2 years or less, the timer would expire and my spouse would receive the Bitcoin. Is it possible? Or if not, what is the preferred solution to this problem? This is an excellent question. And it's one that's already actually been answered extensively by one of my colleagues on a book that I provided technical advice, but is the only and definitive guide to this topic. Pamela Morgan of Empowered Law has written a book called Cryptoasset Inheritance Planning that in fact covers all of these scenarios, including what you describe, which is generically called the dead man switch approach. And the problem with these types of solutions is that first you're going to have to continuously revise your plan as the technology changes, but worse, you're relying on someone who has little to no key management experience, your spouse, to be able to hold, backup, and recover keys. Not the keys that control your crypto, but the keys into which supposedly the dead man switch will dump the crypto during or after a certain period of time has elapsed. So asking your heirs or trying to teach your heirs to do key management is a recipe for disaster and will result almost certainly in loss of funds. Dead man switches are a very, very bad idea. But then again, inheritance is all about being able to pass your assets to your heirs when you die, and not a minute sooner. And if you create a situation where your death is a honeypot, or if your keys are compromised, people inherit before something happens to you, then essentially not only are you exposing yourself to potentially unreliable members of your family, and if someone's a good family member now and develops a heroin addiction later, well, good luck. People change very dramatically, but also you're exposing them to the risk of making them targets of coercion and other problems because they may have access to key material that can give access to funds. So you're exposing them to that risk too. This is a complex problem, and it's a problem that doesn't have technical solutions only. You have to have both a technical and legal solution. And a lot of the things I'm talking about now come from Pamela Morgan's book, Cryptoasset Inheritance Planning for Owners. It's not a book for lawyers. It's a book for cryptocurrency owners, and it explains how to strike that balance between a good technical plan that can actually be executed, a legal plan that will ensure that there's no problems with lawsuits and legal problems in your inheritance, and how to balance that really, really carefully. Now, this is unique work that hasn't been replicated in the industry, although a lot of companies out there have copied the ideas and are spreading them in a variety of products. This is not simply something you can solve with products. You need to think about the process carefully, and you need to balance it carefully. So you can find information, including a bunch of articles on the website empoweredlaw.com, and look up that book. But the bottom line is, do not use a dead man switch. It is not a safe practice. The problems come with key management by non-experts. 99% of people could not pull this off anyway themselves, let alone expect the heirs to achieve a recovery after something happens to them. You need to think about this in a different way. Unfortunately, technology isn't always the right solution. Sometimes low-tech solutions, especially in cases where you have to deal with non-technical heirs, low-tech solutions are actually much, much better. Let me just jump in the chat room, take a brief break here, see how things are going. All right, I hope people are having fun. Let's move on to the next question. Next question comes from Dimitris. Accepting donations via Lightning, is it possible? The Lightning Network provides speed, anonymity, and low fees. If that's the case, why won't you accept donations via Lightning? Please correct me if you do. It is unclear to me how to do basic stuff like receiving money without creating invoices. Can you please explain how this might work? So what you're talking about is a particular subset of Lightning functions which is not yet specified as an interoperable standard that can be supported by all Lightning clients. But one of the interesting things that's happening in Lightning is that different Lightning clients implement different features at different times, and they don't have to all coordinate or follow the same roadmap. So extensions to the interoperability standards can still be implemented independently. This type of thing is called invoiceless payment, so payment without invoice, because as you rightly said, one of the challenges for accepting Lightning payments is that you have to generate an invoice in order to receive a Lightning payment under most implementations and under current circumstances. But actually there are ways to do what's known as an invoiceless payment, whereby you can send a Lightning payment without having first received an invoice. And some implementations of Lightning already support this. There's actually a link in the answer to the question that was submitted by Dimitris for a plugin that operates under the Lightning B implementation. So you can see that and see how that might work. I currently don't accept donations via Lightning, and part of the reason I don't accept donations via Lightning is because my Lightning node is still in an experimental stage. And I don't want to necessarily direct funds, too many funds there, because that would be reckless, you know, and I don't want people to lose their money because they tried to send me a payment via Lightning, and then I have some problem with my node that causes me to lose money. So I'm not quite ready yet. However, I do have a technical implementation that I am testing where I would like to accept Lightning payments in the near future. And the way I'm doing that is by combining Lightning node, which I've been running now for just over 2 years, in fact. I run a version of LND as well as a version of C Lightning, which are two different implementations of Lightning nodes. And on top of that, I also run a BTC Pay server, which is an infrastructure component that allows you to manage both Bitcoin, Lightning, and many other UTXO compatible chains like Litecoin and things like that, and allows you to generate invoices, generate payments, run point of sale systems, etc., that are completely decentralized in nature, meaning that they're non-custodial. You are not going through a third-party provider. It's a self-hosted solution. It's open source. You run the server yourself, and that allows you to generate both Bitcoin invoices in order to receive incoming payments, as well as Lightning invoices to receive incoming payments. This was originally created as a counterpoint to a popular commercial service called BitPay, which is both custodial in nature and generates invoices that are not compatible with most wallets due to certain political considerations. And BTC Pay was designed as an API-compatible, self-hosted, non-custodial alternative, and I really like that project. I'm not endorsing the organization that's behind it, but it's a collaborative project by many developers, and I use it personally. It works well for me. I use BTC Pay to invoice my customers. For example, to invoice conferences that want to pay me in Bitcoin. Now that's not a Lightning payment because it makes more sense to do that as an on-chain payment because conference payments generally are not under $150. The sweet spot for Lightning payments is for smaller payments, because for large payments then it's just as easy to do it on-chain. And I'm also running the Lightning node and the Lightning implementation. In the next few weeks, I will be announcing a simple merchandise store that has some nice meme-worthy t-shirts. Patrons, you've already seen that. That store accepts both Bitcoin and Lightning using that BTC Pay server and the underlying Lightning node infrastructure that I've been building for the last 2 years. It allows me to further experiment with this technology, but also to show it to both my patrons and the public at large. So there's a good chance that I will be adding a Lightning donation capability to my website for people who want to donate money with Lightning in the near future. That will require generating an invoice on my end, and I'm not yet ready to experiment with invoiceless Lightning payments. But that's certainly possible in the future. Lightning can operate in such a way that you can send payments without an invoice. It has been demonstrated repeatedly at Lightning conferences and other places. These are still experimental features. We're still in the process of experimentation on some of these features where they will probably be standardized and introduced in a way that can be implemented by all Lightning clients in a future version of the Bolt standards, the Bolt specifications, if you like. Bolt stands for Basis of Lightning Technology, and it's a set of standards that allow Lightning clients to interoperate with each other in a fairly consistent way. We're currently in the first version of those standards, and a new version is expected in the next year or so to add more interoperability capabilities across new features like invoiceless payments. Anthony asks, Electrum on Tails. In the newest versions of the Tails operating system, also known as the Amnesiac Incognito Live System, that's what Tails stands for, and in fact I didn't know that until I read this question earlier today. Tails stands for the Amnesiac Incognito Live System. There is an Electrum wallet, and that Electrum wallet is working because they upgraded after there was an update problem with Electrum that fooled some people by presenting fake versions of the software. The question by Anthony is, what are your thoughts on using the Tails operating system and primarily using Electrum on Tails to increase one's privacy and for cold storage? The thing about running Electrum on Tails is that if you configure Tails correctly, it leaves behind no information because you boot off a CD or USB with no permanent storage. And you can also use a privacy enhancing technology such as the Tor network, the onion routed network for anonymity. And it has many other features to preserve your privacy and anonymity. However, you can't use, or you shouldn't use the Electrum system on Tails without a hardware wallet to actually store your keys. So putting keys inside a Tails distribution is obviously dangerous. And bootstrapping Electrum and typing in the seed on Tails every time you bootstrap Electrum is maybe suitable for a hot wallet, absolutely unsuitable for cold storage, and therefore should be avoided. However, the combination of Tails, Electrum, and a hardware wallet that actually has the keys is a pretty good, decent, I would say, implementation. There is one other way to do this, which I actually prefer, which is rather than using Tails, which is mostly a privacy-focused distribution, I have tried and somewhat succeeded running Electrum on Cubes. And Cubes is an operating system. It's spelled Q-U-B-E-S. And it's an operating system that's designed not so much for privacy, but primarily for sandbox security, meaning that in Cubes, every single application you see on your desktop will run in one domain, and that domain is effectively a separate virtual machine that is completely isolated from everything else. You can't clipboard things across from one place to another. All of the windows running in your desktop run with reduced privileges. They don't have access to input mechanisms like keyboards, screens, mice, etc. Unless they're in focus. They use kernel level isolation between windows to ensure that each application is sandboxed. Now, in that kind of environment, if you run Electrum in its own separate sandbox, separate from the operating system, separate from other applications running on the desktop, and you also run communication software like Tor in order to increase your privacy, you can get a result that is at least as good as Tails and possibly superior. Because if there is some kind of problem with one of the other applications installed on the operating system, it can't cross the barrier or the sandbox and access data that is in the Electrum sandbox or your crypto sandbox. Whereas when you're running Tails, all of the applications that are installed in the Tails operating system that are running within your user environment in your desktop have equal access and permission, more or less, to the various devices. And it's a lot easier to break those boundaries between applications in an operating system where there isn't sandboxing. So there's another idea for you. Tails, Electrum, hardware wallet, yes. Tails, Electrum, typing in the seed every time or using it for a hot wallet, nah, that's not good cold storage and it might be dangerous. And while that will give you good privacy, maybe Cubes, Electrum, and a hardware wallet would give you even better security, especially for a very, very high security cold storage solution, where you have a clean OS boot every time, and that clean OS boot is into an operating system that has sandboxing implemented, and you still keep your keys on a hardware wallet, or even several hardware wallets using multi-sig and hardware wallets from different manufacturers. Again, you can keep layering the level of security you want. Just be careful and make sure you have sufficient backups. As always, where the keys are really, really matters. Great question, Anthony. Loic asks, Andreas, to what extent do you recommend CoinJoins? Do you still think this could be made illegal? And to reiterate for a bit more context, what is a CoinJoin? A CoinJoin is some kind of implementation where a transaction involves multiple participants providing inputs, meaning that a transaction can have multiple inputs and multiple outputs. Neither the inputs nor the outputs have to come from the same person or the same wallet or the same controlling entity. You could have yourself and 3 of your friends construct a transaction where you take an input each and sign it, and then make a payment each, and you have 4 inputs and 4 outputs so that each of you gets to pay your favorite thing, whatever that may be. And if you look at that transaction, it's very difficult to see where the inputs and where the outputs are going. Now, if you chain several of these together, so you have a transaction with 100 participants and 100 inputs, 100 outputs, and then those outputs are sent into a transaction that has 100 inputs and 100 outputs, and those outputs are sent into a transaction. You do multiple rounds of these. By the end of it, it's incredibly difficult to do statistical analysis of where those coins come. However, you do know, or rather the analytics surveillance companies that monitor blockchain, the blockchain surveillance companies, they do know that those outputs came from a CoinJoin. Because it's fairly obvious that a transaction that has 100 inputs and 100 outputs is unlikely to be a run-of-the-mill payment by a single user's wallet. So a CoinJoin doesn't provide identity information. However, as far as the surveillance companies are concerned, it will taint your output points because they will then flag that as high risk if you try to move those outputs further down the chain to a merchant or exchange that is using surveillance companies to both spy on its users and score the risk of transactions. So do I recommend CoinJoins? It depends on the circumstances and what you're trying to do. If you regularly move money into and out of regulated entities like exchanges, and you want that money to still work on those exchanges, you will carry your identity with you on all of those transactions. And if you do CoinJoin somewhere in between, you may find your account being shut down, frozen, or even your coin seized by this custodial entity because they consider them tainted, risky, or something like that. If you're doing transactions between your own wallets, private wallets of other individuals, you're using it to do things where you need to preserve privacy, like paying payroll for employees and things like that, and neither you nor the others in the chain are particularly interested in exchanging these for fiat or using them to buy products from regulated merchants and things like that, then that might be a very good privacy solution for you. As to whether this could be made illegal, the word illegal should always be followed by the question, where? Could this be made illegal? Illegal where? You know, dancing is illegal in some countries. Legal, illegal depends very, very much on jurisdiction. I can't even tell you what is legal or illegal in many countries because it's impossible to know. Even in a single country, let's say the United States, if you ask a lawyer, is this legal? They'll ask you where, because the next question is in which state, because there are overlapping state and federal jurisdictions, especially when it comes to things like money transmission. And it also depends on what type of entity we're talking about, if it's an individual versus a corporation. A corporation that is doing things that involve CoinJoins or transactions like that may be considered a money transmitter under certain state laws. An individual would unlikely be considered a money transmitter, but you know, again, whether it's legal or illegal, I can't really tell you that. It very much depends on your jurisdiction. So ask a lawyer about that, preferably a lawyer who understands both tax law as well as various other laws related to and regulations related to money transmission, anti-money laundering rules and things like that. And absolutely it could be made illegal in the future. It may even already be illegal under some interpretations, and then it's maybe more a matter of, are you likely to be targeted for prosecution, which is a tricky thing for people who are high profile in this industry and likely to be targeted. So do I recommend CoinJoins? I can recommend CoinJoins because I don't know where you live and whether that would be a legal or a smart thing to do. But here's what I can tell you. If you're a political activist in North Korea, if you're a protester in Hong Kong, if you're part of the opposition movement or political party in Venezuela, if you're trying to overthrow a dictator, do I recommend CoinJoins? Hell yes, I do. And if it's illegal, then in many cases it may be just, meaning that it is in promotion of justice and morally ethical, perhaps even a moral obligation to fight back against a tyrannical regime that is destroying your country or persecuting a minority or something like that. And then you should absolutely fight back. The fact that it is illegal is part of the problem in tyrannical governments. Even here in the US, everything the founding fathers did, including signing the Declaration of Independence, was not only illegal, it was in fact treason against the crown. We seem to forget sometimes that even treasonous acts can be justified in the face of tyranny. I think that's a good place. To wrap things up. To all of those who came to my happy hour in San Francisco, which was attended by more than 25 people, thank you so much for coming. It was a real pleasure to see you. I really appreciate you coming and talking to me and hanging out. It was really wonderful to meet with many of my old friends and supporters, as well as new patrons who have just joined. To those of you who came to the community event at Starfish and came and said hello, some old patrons, some brand new patrons, again, welcome and thank you so much for your support. I would not be able to do the work I do, to travel and do free community events that are open, to do things like publish all of my work for free, and to support the reach and range we have due to the incredible staff that support me, my entire team, who are funded entirely by Patreon donations. I wouldn't be able to do all of this work if it wasn't for your help. So my mission is to bring education about Bitcoin and open public blockchains to as many people around the world in as many languages as possible. And in the last 2 years, thanks to Patreon, we have not only survived crypto winter, we've expanded our reach by an order of magnitude, and you are making that happen. Everything I do is because of your help and support and contributions and your moral support, and thank you so much. I enjoyed this Q&A a lot, some really great questions. We're going to do our next one towards the end of November. Will be announced the next week. Don't forget that in order to do a good Q&A, I have to have good questions. We're going to be cleaning the slate again today, and then you can go and submit your questions, vote, comment. A lot of people actually responded, commented, and added information to questions this time. That's a great move. I hope to see you all next month. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.